Login accepted.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today to discuss a topic incredibly relevant in our rapidly evolving digital landscape, data privacy in the age of big data. My name is Nabeel Samad, and I'm thrilled to dive deeper into a topic which is super passionate for myself. So first off, a little bit about myself. I'm currently a senior principal engineer and a tech lead at Splunk. For people who don't know what Splunk, the company, it's the leading platform for searching, analyzing machine data analytics. And we've got a great booth down at Devoxx. We're giving out free swag, so please, if you have time, definitely go pay us a visit. Now, to get back on topic, first off, the question is, why is data privacy important? As we all know, we live in an age where data is everywhere. Every click, every swipe, every interaction we have online is both captured, stored, and analyzed. This explosion of big data basically means that we have both tremendous opportunity, but also tremendous challenges for dealing with the large volumes of data like this. So let's first start by analyzing the large sheer volume of data which is generated daily. According to recent studies, 2.5 quintillion bytes of data are generated every day. This data comes from all sorts of sources, from social media, online transaction, IoT devices, and much more. This is also the first time I've used quintillion in a sentence, so I'll scratch that off my bucket list. But with such large volumes of data, companies have lots of insights at their disposal, which previously was unimaginable, even 10, 15 years ago. Just the sheer amount of data being generated. To use a common Spider-Man quote here, with great power comes great responsibility. So the collection and the analysis of data like this raises critical questions about data privacy. So how do we ensure that customers and our individuals' personal data is protected in this age of big data analytics? What measures do we have to implement to balance the benefits of data analytics with the need to safeguard privacy? In this session, I'm going to explore several of these key areas. We'll number one, look at the current state of data privacy regulations around the globe. We'll dive into the ethical considerations and challenges of data collection and analysis. And we'll also look at best practices for ensuring data privacy. And in addition, we'll also look at how organizations have navigated this complexity and how they've managed to implement proper privacy controls based on whatever industry they're in. So by the end of the time our talk, hopefully we'll have a deeper understanding of the importance of data privacy, and hopefully you're equipped with some actionable insights to tackle data privacy problems at your own work, or personal project, or what have you. So first off, an introduction to data, like in today's landscape, why is data privacy critical and crucial? It's crucial to maintain not only protecting personal information, but also to maintain public trust. As data collection and processing capabilities of systems have increased, so have the risks of data breaches and misuse have been increased dramatically. So consider high-profile incidents like the Equifax breach in 2017, the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal in 2016. These were events which caused significant financial damage, legal issues, and also a loss of public trust for those companies. They underscore a need for strong data privacy measures. So data privacy isn't just a legal requirement, it's an ethical obligation, and organizations must handle data responsibly to build trust for their customers and to maintain positive relationship with their customers. And with the criticality of data privacy, there are both ethical and legal implications. So ethical considerations in data privacy focus on transparency, consent, and accountability. Organizations should be clear about their data practices, how they should get explicit consent from individuals, and then take responsibility for the data they hold and they should protect. So we'll talk about later in the session about global data protection regulations we have to safeguard personal data. GDPR in the EU, the CCPA in the US, and these laws impose strict requirements on data residency, data collection, storage, and sharing. And non-compliance for these regulations can lead to severe penalties. I'll go into more detail later in the presentation, but just for your info, like GDPR, if you violate any provision in GDPR, you can be fined up to 4% of your global revenue, or 20 million, depending on whatever is higher. So basically, like it reinforces the notion that data privacy should not be taken lightly. So the other aspect which we should all be aware of is, like, we want to stay informed of and compliant of the evolving data privacy laws and landscape. It's not only for the sake of our customers, but also to avoid legal repercussions depending on if we're trying to build a culture of trust and responsibility for our customers. We'll look at case studies in the presentation on how organizations have successfully utilized strategies like data anonymization, masking, and secure access controls to place proper controls on how their data is stored with the proper consent and the proper protections. Now, moving on. First off, now I think we hear about what big data, the word thrown around a lot. It's sort of now one of those buzzwords, which sort of like AI, which can mean many things depending on who you talk to. For the purpose of this talk, I'll start briefly on big data is basically, to me at least, characterized by three main aspects: the volume of the data, the velocity of the data, and the variety of the data. This refers to the enormous amounts of data being generated by our systems, on the internet, by customer transactions, by Linux servers, by web applications all across our digital landscape. And by analyzing these vast data sets, organizations can have more actionable insights and drive innovation and operational efficiency. So today I'll give you some examples of how, in different industries, at least we've seen at Splunk, how customer data is used and how data analytics tools like Splunk are used to solve customer problems across different industry verticals. First example I'll give is Singapore Airlines. So Splunk, they're a customer of Splunk. They use Splunk to monitor their real-time IT infrastructure. Singapore Airlines is one of the largest airlines in the Southeast Asia, based out of Singapore, of course. But using Splunk, they analyze every ticket booking, every record they have for ticketing, and then they make sure that they have the right issue detection and then mean time to resolution. So this is an example of an airline industry storing large amounts of data, customer data in a metric store or an analytics store like Splunk. And it basically begs the questions like, how is this data stored? What are the right privacy controls in place? And how these industries are maintaining the proper safeguards in place. One other example I can think of is Fannie Mae. Fannie Mae, or if you expand the acronym, it's basically the Federal National Mortgage Broker. It's a government-backed enterprise in the US, which basically expands the secondary market for mortgages. It's basically like a semi-government entity which provides liquidity to the US housing market. So Fannie Mae utilizes Splunk's unified monitoring capabilities to achieve greater efficiencies. Similar IT have operational spend on their IT infrastructure. This enhanced ability helps them trace and monitor financial transactions. So now we have a different customer and completely different industry vertical, finance, where we're using a data analytics tool to monitor financial transactions. And by using Splunk, they not only ingest metrics, but also logs across their entire IT suite, which runs in hundreds and thousands of servers. So they use Splunk to detect anomalies and Splunk's data analytics capabilities in identifying trends and patterns, which can sort of help them inform strategic decisions and improve their overall posture. So now we've done airlines, we've done financial industry. Continental is another example of a German automotive manufacturing company which specializes in brake system chassis and automotive safety equipment. So similarly, Continental uses Splunk, completely different industry, to Splunk's capabilities to proactively monitor and do issue detection and resolution, leading to improved productivity and innovation for their customers. So it's basically another vertical where you have a company ingesting large amounts of data into a product like Splunk, and then they have the same privacy mechanisms which need to be enforced depending on the data they're ingesting. The last example I want to definitely share is one NTT Data. It is a global IT provider and consultancy headquartered in Japan. It offers broad services, consulting, systems integration, and outsourcing worldwide. So NTT Data utilizes Splunk for their IT infrastructure and their security operations teams to quickly detect and respond to security threats, ensuring the protection of their sensitive data and maintaining regulatory compliance. So these examples illustrates, how tools powerful data analytics tools like Splunk with the right monitoring capabilities are used to ensure data privacy, operational efficiency, and regulatory compliance. Now, with these examples, it sort of begs the question, what are the privacy needs for all of these different companies across industries with different customers, different use cases? So it's sort of I think we need to hone in the message that as organizations continue to collect more and more data, the need for robust privacy measures increases. Protecting personal information is essential for maintaining public trust and to adhere to ethical and legal standards. So I think with each of these companies, the risk of the more data they ingest, the more risk of data breaches also increases. So one of the other things these companies need to adhere to is not only to maintain the right posture to avoid data breaches, but also have the right regulatory compliance regimes in place to avoid hefty fines from GDPR and CCPA, and to safeguard the personal information of their customers. So it's supremely important, basically, I think, to have the right data protection mechanisms, given how companies across different industries are ingesting large troves of data, which not only from airlines or to health to finance, but also consumer-facing companies too. So now I think sort of giving you an overview of how examples of how data analytics tools are used to ingest different data sets. I would want to quickly dive deep on the compliance and regulations we have in the data space, in the data privacy space. So, of course, in the EU, you're aware of GDPR. GDPR is a comprehensive data protection law, authored by the EU, by the European Union. It mandates how organizations collect, store, and process personal information. One of the key principles of GDPR are basically data minimization, purpose limitation, meaning you need to have a limited purpose of the data you collect, confidentiality, integrity, data accuracy, and storage limitations, which means that you cannot move data cross borders from the EU's sanctioned borders. The GDPR also grants individuals rights. So basically what they're called data subject rights, which means they have the right to access, to rectify, erase, and port their data depending on their use case. It also includes the right to object to data processing and automated decision-making based on if a company's ingested someone's data or is using their data for a certain time. So with GDPR's introduction, it imposed strict limitations on businesses, and they forced companies to rethink their data handling practices. So now they're mandated, so organizations are mandated to ensure data is collected in the right way. It's explicit, it has legitimate purposes, and it's not further processed in a manner which is incompatible with the purposes they signed up for. And GDPR is also, for the first time, they introduced like hefty fines. I think, as I mentioned earlier, 4% of your annual global turnover if companies do deviate from these regulations and protections. The other main compliance regulation is the California Consumer Privacy Act, which is a statewide law for California. Now, generally, the US does not have a national privacy law like the EU, but California is sort of usually at the forefront of privacy regulations, and because of California, a lot of companies are forced to adapt for the US market. So CCPA sort of acts like a wider law, not just in California itself. Some of the key principles of the California Consumer Privacy Act are similar to GDPR. It forces transparency, gives customers control over their own personal information, and holds businesses accountable for data privacy practices. It also includes more consumer rights, so basically like rights of personal data. Businesses have clear and consistent privacy policies that explain the rights for consumers and how they exercise them. CCPA also introduces fines like up to $7,500 for intentional and $25 for unintentional violations of these regulations. Other regulations which should get an honorable mention are Brazil's GDPR law, similar to how the EU's law, it's modeled on the same lines. It's focused on companies operating in Brazil. Another important one I should mention is the Australia's Privacy Act of 1988. It has similar data residency requirements for Australian organizations. And then lastly, I think Singapore's Personal Data Protection Act governs the collection, use of disclosure of personal data in Singapore. So that's sort of the regulatory landscape of data privacy regulations across the globe. And now, I think as organizations and companies, it's important that you are in compliance of all of these various regimes, depending on where your customers are. So to ensure compliance, it's sort of a moving target because these regimes are continuously evolving, and one of the mechanisms you should, as a company, should always take is you should do regular audits to identify potential compliance gaps and make sure you have the right data collection, storage, and processing and sharing practices implemented. The other thing companies should always mandate is what's generally called data protection officers. Or basically like they're sort of in-house experts which help oversee compliance for data privacy. They manage the strategies. They serve as the point of contact in the company for data privacy regulation. And lastly, I think one other practice we should implement is employee training. It goes without saying, but implementing ongoing training programs, even though some of them are annoying to click through, but are important for general awareness for employees, like to educate themselves on what the latest data privacy regulations are. And as companies, I think you sort of have to keep updated on the landscape because it's continuously evolving, as I mentioned. Generally, it's a good practice for larger companies who are manipulating large data sets on behalf of their customers to stay ahead and then keep track how regulatory bodies are and privacy organizations are changing the data protection laws. And I think the other thing basically we should do is always consult with the right experts, legal experts, to ensure data privacy and then have the right regulations in place. So now giving you sort of an idea of what the regulatory landscape looks like, I wanted to kind of touch on the ethical side of data privacy. Like what exactly does that mean? What are the main pillars of how companies should have ethical principles on consuming data on behalf of their customers. One of the biggest pillars, in my mind at least, is transparency and consent. So transparency in data collection and usage is critical. So organizations should clearly communicate what data they're collecting, how it's being used, and who it will be shared with. This transparency helps build trust with consumers and helps them understand how their data is being used. Now, it's sort of important as a consumer for us to know how, when you do a transaction online, how that data could be used on your behalf, and you should be fully aware and you should be fully cognizant of how data collection of a company's data collection practices. Now, I'll give an example of how some companies sometimes do not follow these ethical practices. If, say, regulatory regimes haven't caught up, and then there can be severe backlash. One example is a project by Google called Google Nightingale, Project Nightingale, which was sort of a partnership with a hospital association and in the US. It was a large healthcare system of 2,600 hospitals with hospitals, doctors' offices, and related facilities. So Google's basically take was they'll partner with Accenture was the name of the organization, and process healthcare data. So Google wanted a foothold in the healthcare industry, and this was sort of their play on partnering with a large hospital system which already had all the mechanisms in place to collect the user data, and then sort of ingest and then do analysis based on some. I'm sure they had a business plan on how they would monetize it down the line. But what happened was that the Wall Street Journal is a newspaper in the U.S. They sort of got to know that in 2019 that Google did not have the right disclosures in place. So they had not told doctors and patients that, hey, millions of customers' data is being accessed by 150 Google employees, and then they're doing XYZ on it without the proper disclosures. And that sort of created a big backlash against this project. Because customers, especially healthcare data, is so sensitive and so personal for a lot of users that knowing that a big anonymous tech company is manipulating or using your healthcare information was not really didn't set well for a lot of people. So now moving on to the second pillar of ethical data handling, I want to talk about accountability and responsibility. Organizations must be accountable for the data they collect. This sort of involves they should implement strong security measures and take responsibility of any misuse of data. Now, one example which comes to mind is the Equifax data breach. I'm sure everyone's heard this was the largest data breach in the history in recent memory. In 2017, Equifax is a US-based credit card reporting agency failed to protect the personal information of approximately 147 million customers. So this breach exposed social security numbers, which are sort of like really, in the US at least, they're meant to be private. It exposed driver's licenses, birth dates, and other really sensitive information. So it sort of highlighted the deficiencies Equifax had and their data practices and their response measures to a breach. The fallout from this breach was significant. The company faced multiple lawsuits. They were required to pay $700 million in fines and had to pay compensation for their affected consumers. And for years on end, Equifax sort of lost a massive trust. There was a major trust deficit, and then it led for a lot of negative press from customers on this particular company because of their data handling practices. So basically, it's not only that you're doing injustice to your customers, you're also destroying your brand if you don't have the right privacy controls in place. So it's sort of supremely important for companies to have clear policies and practices for data collection and analysis. So they should have transparency, fairness, and responsibility while handling data from both inception to how data is disposed of. Another important example in the ethical side of things is the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica scandal back in 2016. I think I don't know if you were aware, like when it was at the time of the last U.S. presidential, the previous U.S. presidential election, where it was revealed that Cambridge Analytica, it's sort of a political consulting firm, harvested the personal data of like millions of Facebook users without their consent. This was used to influence voter fraud, voter behavior in political campaigns during the 2016 US presidential election and the Brexit referendum. So it sort of started, this would have been completely hidden from the public, but there was a whistleblower who came forward and exposed that Cambridge Analytica, this political consulting firm, had obtained data of 87 million Facebook users. So what happened is basically they sort of had a Facebook app, which was sort of a personality quiz for voters to just judge if you're conservative or liberal or some sort of a quiz like that. Around 270,000 people used the quiz and the app. But what ended up happening is that the app collected, without telling them, data on themselves and their friends, leading into a huge data breach. So the fallout from this scandal was significant, right? Facebook faced intense scrutiny from regulators. The CEO was brought before Congress to testify on what happened. They were fined $5 billion by the Federal Trade Commission, which is the agency which regulates privacy violations in the US. It was the largest fine ever imposed on a tech company for violating consumer privacy. So this sort of example highlights the fact that how companies, it's a moral obligation and an ethical obligation for companies to have, especially in Facebook's case, they had a lack of transparency. Customers were not aware of their data being collected and used in this way. They had insecure or inadequate security measures. Facebook's data protection was insignificant to prevent unauthorized data loss. And there was both an absence of accountability from both Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. And they didn't take responsibility for their actions. So I think it sort of reinforces the fact that organizations must align their data practices with ethical principles, including transparency, consent, and accountability, the holy trifecta. This goes beyond legal compliance and is sort of essential to maintaining public trust with your customers. So, I mean, on the other side of the house, you have companies which sort of champion data privacy. Apple is a good example of which they're more privacy centric. They've implemented features like app tracking, transparency, which lets customers have greater control on data which is being used on iOS devices. So I think it's sort of really important for companies to buttress their brand, to have the right ethical grounding rules in place as an organization when they manipulate data on behalf of their customers, because it's sort of a sacred trust. We're giving away personal details to companies, which it could be used not always to our benefit. Now, shifting gears a bit, I do want to talk about how we can secure data processing based on just things you can do as an org. I'm going to talk about it at a really high level. Won't go into really technical detail, but sort of I think 3 things we should be aware of how we implement secure data processing is, number 1, encryption. Basically, encryption is a process that converts data from readable format into an unreadable encoded format where unauthorized users can't have access to that. This method is crucial for maintaining data confidentiality. There are 2 types of encryption: symmetric encryption and asymmetric encryption. I don't think I will go too much into detail, but sort of the TLDR is that symmetric encryption uses the same key to encrypt and decrypt. This method is fast, more efficient, but it requires proper key management controls. So the same key has to live on each side of how data is being transferred from one end to the other. Asymmetric encryption uses a pair of keys, as the name suggests, a public key for encryption and a private key for decryption. So now, sort of why I'm giving you a 30,000-foot view here is encryption is super critical for protecting sensitive information, especially personal data. Even if data is breached or intercepted, if it's encrypted, it's unreadable and bad actors can't manipulate that. One of the other things we generally employ for data privacy is tokenization. Tokenization is, at a really high level, the process of replacing sensitive data fields with what we call tokens. Basically, it means that to retain this essential information without compromising security. So tokens can be used in an application and databases in place of sensitive data. The actual data is stored securely, and in place, you sort of have this token which doesn't convey the same meaning. Now, tokenization is a technique which reduces the risk of data breaches by ensuring sensitive information is not stored in its original form. One example of tokenization is how credit card companies use tokenization during credit card transactions, which significantly reduces the risk of data theft. And the last pillar for secure data processing is access control. It goes without saying, but only authorized people should have the right access to sensitive data, depending on how your data storage needs. Basically, like that sort of means it should be authenticated properly. Depending on the identity of the user, you should have proper controls on who has access to what sort of data you have. It should be properly authorized, meaning even if you are an employee of the company, there should be tiers of access. It shouldn't be that anyone in the company can just go and download all of your, for example, credit card processing data. And the other thing we should emphasize is, should have proper auditing controls in place. It should have, we should keep a record of who's accessed data and when, and keep that in a secure format where, like, in the event of a data breach, we have the ability to trace like who accessed what, and then we have and detect like unauthorized access. So I will pause here for questions if people do have questions, but before I could dive into more privacy-centric content. No questions. Sounds like I'm doing great. So I think like now sort of we've gone through the idea, like the high level, like what big data analytics is, how companies utilize data, what the compliance regimes are. Now what's important is like how does data privacy, why is that important for our organizations today? I think the sort of the question for us is, how do we inculcate or how do we create this spirit of data privacy for if you're working at a company, like how do we sort of create that spirit? We have data regulations in place which force you to do it, but generally there's a culture which needs to be created in companies too. So data privacy is crucial for to protect individuals like from breaches and misuse. And I think like for organizations today, in addition to the laws we talked about, non-compliance can result in fines. It can result in your brand getting tarnished. And it's sort of, and also an ethical obligation, as I think we talked about earlier. Now, the other question I think people ask is like, what strategies can be used to promote data privacy amongst employees in a company? Now, it's sort of, we have now a good rule book of training and education. Companies should conduct regular training sessions to educate their employees on what the best data practices are, the potential risks of data breaches, and the role of employees in safeguarding data. So, generally, I think a good example is companies should use a mixture of e-learning, and in-house training to ensure employees are well-versed in data privacy. These are nuanced topics, so I think like, the more training we have for your employees, the better. The other key pillar is clear policies and guidelines. So basically, companies should develop and disseminate comprehensive data privacy policies that sort of outline how data should be stored and handled, and these should be easily accessible to any employee which wants to sort of look into that. And lastly, I think it's super critical for the leadership team to have the right support, and then they participate in data privacy initiatives, because it can't be just top down. It can't be just bottoms up. It sort of reinforces if your exec team or the C-suite has the right privacy that they need to sort of reinforce the importance of data privacy. Now, which leads to the question, like, how do we get executives to get buy-in into data privacy initiatives? So it's super. I mean, for generally any initiative, executive buy-in is critical, right? Like we need leadership sort of to prioritize projects which sort of have the right mix of business and customer value proposition. For privacy itself, it's not exactly a revenue driver. So it's not like if you implement better privacy controls, you'll make more money. So you have to sort of have the executives need to have the right mindset to say like allocate the right resources and have the mindset that if you don't do this, what are the implications? You'll have loss of trust from your customers. Your brand can get tarnished, and you can get fined. So basically, like I think a lot of companies we've seen now have started hiring chief privacy officers, which report up into the C-suite. So it's a position adjacent to the CISO. But having executives like this champion data privacy can drive cultural change. It can make a core organizational value rather than just a compliance regime or just a compliance checkbox. I think like the other questions that generally we hear people ask is, what role does training play in fostering a privacy-centric culture? Ongoing education. I think we talked about like how it's important for companies to have proper education and trainings in place to keep them well educated on what the compliance regimes are on that side. And also, I think it's sort of you have to sort of have the right customized training programs depending on whatever industry you're in. For example, like IT might need some other technical training different from your developers or your QA or operations staff. I think lastly, I mean, I do want to touch on, I think it's sort of there's this natural tension on if you do invest in data privacy, it does slow down, has the potential of slowing down innovation. So how do you sort of balance ethical use of data with like balancing innovation? I'm speaking in really broad terms here, but basically like there has to be, there's a balance between leveraging data for innovation and respecting your consumers' privacy rights, because nobody likes, big tech at least doesn't like more regulations. So by implementing privacy by design, I think it's important that whenever new products are launched and new services are developed, privacy considerations are started from the outset. It's not an afterthought. And it's sort of like, I think the dialogue needs to start earlier, with like your legal teams and the privacy officers need to sort of have a say in the product lifecycle, and then they need to have the proper collaboration in place early on. And lastly, I think like how do companies ensure accountability in data privacy? So, I think we talked a little bit about this, but basically having the right audit scheme, like the right accountability structures, right roles and responsibilities ensures that privacy across the org is we have the right accountability in place. And lastly, I think companies generally don't do a good job of this, but transparency in reporting on how data is handled. If your company has had a breach, what are the right ways you sort of let your customers know that breaches happen, because we can't prevent breaches forever. So having, I've seen practices where companies have an annual transparency report detailing data privacy practices and incidents they've had. So I think quickly, I would maybe just sort of just doing a quick time check, maybe just jump directly ahead with talking about latest trends and future outlook in the privacy landscape. So I think like we've talked about how the current regulations, the evolving landscape of how regulations on GDPR, like ethical considerations of data privacy. Now I think like at the end, I do want to sort of have a more future-oriented vision on like how this space is evolving. So currently, there's more and more investment in privacy preserving technologies. Like we have more advanced encryption. Organizations are adopting advanced encryption methods like homomorphic encryption to ensure data remains secure even during processing. So sort of to do the uninitiated, homomorphic encryption allows computation on encrypted data. So you don't even need to de-encrypt to do some processing on what you're doing, which allows, it's supremely useful then In scenarios where sensitive data has to be processed, then in case of a data breach, since the data doesn't need to be encrypted, it's still secure. Other techniques companies have started using is what called differential privacy. Differential privacy adds statistical noise to data sets, meaning it makes it difficult to identify exactly the exact data points. So it's sort of more anonymized, and you still can get predictive analytics. You can do accurate analytics on large data sets, but it's hard to identify an individual data point. This method is used by larger companies like Apple and Google to enhance their data privacy. If an attacker does get access somehow to this information, it is increasingly it'll be harder to do pinpoint exactly one data point. So this sort of differential privacy is being used in healthcare analysis and machine learning applications, of course. Now, of course, in 2024, I'd be remiss to not mention AI. So even in the data privacy landscape, we have sort of improvements in the with AI to have more real-time monitoring on data privacy techniques, which sort of one aspect of that is real-time monitoring. So we have sort of tools like Splunk, AI-driven data analytics protection tools, which sort of do real-time monitoring of data activities, enabling more quicker detection and more quicker response to potential security data breaches. So these tools help sort of continuously analyze data flow and user behavior. And using AI systems, they can detect suspicious activities and trigger alerts to say, a malicious actor is trying to access data they don't have access to, should not have access to. Other aspects of AI-centric compliance are automated compliance, which basically means we have quote-unquote AI systems which can automate compliance with data privacy regulations. It's sort of a lot of checkbox-style compliance regimes. Having more automation on that front helps ensure that organizations are up to date on these evolving regulations. So you don't have to have one. If you take the human out, it gets and have automated compliance tools generate reports. It makes everyone's lives easier. Lastly, we have enhanced threat detection. So AI enhances detection capabilities by analyzing vast amounts of data at a really high volume, and we can detect cyber threats and much more quicker than say a traditional SOC security operations team can. So with enhanced threat detection, it's not only useful for your security posture, but also for preventing data breaches. And it increases, solidifies your data privacy posture. So these more proactive approaches really help mitigate risks before they escalate into a major security incident. And I think looking ahead, we see on the regulatory front, right? We see it's getting more and more stricter. So governments and they're looking at there are more and more data regulations being introduced globally. So I think with this changing landscape, companies are in sort of it's a moving target to keep track of data privacy across these different geographies and different regulatory regimes. So in addition, we have even more data controls being implemented. We have, sort of in addition to China, US, the typical sort of divide you generally have, even more localized cross-border data transfers are getting implemented. So at least it looks like companies would need to implement even more localized storage, data secure storage local to where the consumer resides. So if you're an Australian consumer, even though your data is being used by an American company, likely the Australian government would make you have the data reside locally in Australia. And the other thing sort of we see is consumer rights. Basically, these new laws are focusing more and more and enhancing the power of the consumer. Because data is money, right? Basically, the access to the right to access, correct, and delete personal data is supremely important, given how much of our time we spend online, how much we shop online, all of that is sort of valuable for companies to, for their own sake. So I think like having the consumer know their rights in the data space is supremely important. Other things I'll definitely touch on quickly are, data minimizing data collection. So, it's sort of, in addition to the regulatory regime, companies are being forced to just collect the data they need. So it's called, data minimization in the sense that you just don't do a select all. Control A, that those days are gone. And it reduces its testing. Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Apologies again for the technical difficulties. So lastly, I quickly wrap up here, but with as I think I was mentioning, we have minimized data collection. We have more retention policies, so companies cannot just just store your data indefinitely. There are more and more legal requirements to keep the data only for a specific time. And then I think the other thing I would definitely touch on is that we have automated deletion. So instead of having long-lived retention where, if you bought something from a company or e-commerce site, your data is secure there forever or for eternity and beyond. Now there are proper controls where a company has to have automation to delete or remove or cleanse your data from their systems. I think I sort of quickly conclude, I think we went over compliance regimes, we went over ethical best practices, and then we went over new privacy mechanisms which companies can adapt depending on how they want to handle data. And then I think we walked through some best practices on how companies are, the strategies companies are adopting to ensure data privacy and compliance. I think I'm done, so I do want us to leave some time for some questions. Thank you again for attending the talk. Hopefully this was useful. Sort of gives you a broader idea of how the data privacy landscape is evolving and how companies are adapting to this changing landscape. I'll definitely take a few questions if people have time.